Hi, everybody. I'm Shabir Imbersaftar. I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Safe Medicines. We've been studying counterfeit medicines in America since 2003. I'm going to go through today for this video that we're putting on the website and our pharmacists page information about what your compliance obligations are for a pharmacy under the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. It's actually part of a longer 1 to 1.5 hour talk that we give at pharmacy conferences about recent incidences in the supply chain, how pharmacists can get victimized and defrauded, and then we do the deep dive on the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. But for this video on the website, we're just going to go through the DSCSA obligations. If you're not familiar with the Partnership for Safe Medicines, we're a coalition of only trade associations and nonprofits. No for-profits or members or can give us any in-kind or real donations. And we comprise everybody in the supply chain from the factory floor and the manufacturers who are members through pharma, through the wholesalers to the dispensers and some patient organizations who have a strong interest in pharmacy and pharmacy safety. You can see there's a lot of state pharmacy associations. If your association would like to be a member of PSM, we would love to have you. We keep our dues pretty low for participation. And you get lots of benefits. For example, we can send somebody, if we have somebody available, to give a CE talk like this one to your pharmacy conference and cover most of the costs, because our interest, again, as a nonprofit, is in raising patient safety and raising pharmacist awareness and education around these counterfeit issues. So let me take a moment. We're going to turn off the camera. We're going to jump forward and we're going to go through what the obligations of a pharmacy are under the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. All right, so the Drug Supply Chain Security Act was passed in legislation. I believe it was called the Drug Quality and Security Act back in 2013. And it was created because we as a country had spent the last 13 years watching different incidences of counterfeits breach the supply chain, reach patients, and realized that we needed something better. A number of states, like California notably, was trying to implement a tracking system. And as you can imagine, as other states looked at that, the idea that multiple states would implement different tracking systems for what is basically a national drug supply was terrifying. Right? It would be unimplementable to have a medicine have to comply with multiple different states' tracking systems. But we realized as an industry and as a nation that we didn't have a good tracking system. We couldn't actually figure out who had handled medicine. We had no way to really confirm whether or not a supply chain member was lying about whether or not they had actually got something from someone. It was just words and paper, which is easily forgeable, and that the entire system ran on trust without a lot of verification. And so the decision was made that we needed traceability in our supply chain. It needed to be electronic, interoperable, unit level tracking system. That's important. It's not actually dose level. And you need to be able to identify a legitimate product and try and catch it before it reaches into patient hands. When it was enacted in 2013, a 10-year rollout was set up. And that is coming to an end at the end of 2023. So you probably don't remember when this was enacted. It's been so long. But other members of the supply chain ahead of pharmacies have been doing a lot of work to be compliant. And they had deadlines that were a long time ago. And you're going to start to see, even though you do have some obligations now, compliance issues ramping up in 2023. So let's talk about what isn't in the DSCSA before I tell you what is. It is not edible microtags like those things they put in the mix of the excipient that you see in that middle photo. It's not scratch-off verification systems. It has nothing to do with blockchain, at least in the core technology. Other people have technologies that are blockchain based, but in the core DSCSA, there's nothing about blockchain. There's no RFID tags, no special watermarks or printing pigments. These are all great technologies. Some of them are used in other parts of the world, and people who provide DSCSA solutions might include those. But that's not really what's in the DSCSA itself. The DSCSA is really just a series of technology standards and legal obligations of things you have to do. It is a nationwide system that tracks medication from the factory floor to the pharmacy shelf and no farther. It covers manufacturers, wholesalers, labelers, repackagers, nascently logistics providers, and dispensers. But pharmacies, I believe, in what I learned of the system and how I understand it, they're relieved of most of the burden. And that is because it stops at the pharmacy shelf, which means that when you repackage or you dispense into a smaller container for a patient, you don't need to pass along the DSCSA information. And of course, it's entirely invisible to patients because it stops at the pharmacist. A patient can come to a pharmacist and ask that they do traceability on the medicine they've been given, but the patient themselves neither has the ability to do that tracing nor has to learn or do anything different, which is important. So let's take a look at the tech standards. This is what it looks like. You've got these labeling differences. There's 4 numbers, 2 of which you've been using for a long time, and 2 new ones. And then there's some exchanges, right? Like next year, the software you use on premise in your pharmacy is going to be talking to your prime wholesaler's software, and it's going to be exchanging these serial numbers. Their software is already talking to manufacturers about exchanging serial numbers and batches and so forth. So all of that is part of the tech standards. The legal obligations are pretty straightforward, and they're a little bit different for different kinds of dispensers. As you know, there's pharmacy dispensers, but there's also physicians who dispense in office. Other kinds of dispensers have less obligations than pharmacist dispensers. The 2 obligations everybody has is to only purchase from authorized trading partners. They have to have valid licenses, and you need to keep records of that. That's everybody. So if you're a physician in office, you can't, it's not legal, has never been legal for you, but it's explicitly not legal for you under the DSCSA to purchase from somebody who doesn't have an appropriate wholesale license. You can only also trade products that have these identifiers, the serial number and the GTIN and so forth, unless it's an exempt or grandfathered product. And again, that's everybody. So just because you're an oncologist and you have your own practice, you don't get to buy oncology products without serial numbers. That's not okay. It's not okay for anybody. It's not okay for you. Pharmacists have 3 obligations that they must participate in that are additional. The first of all is that when you're in transactions where it's required that you participate in product tracing, you must both receive and store transaction information, which includes serial number and identities of where you got these products from. And you also must transmit them if you sell them to somebody else. So that's called participating in product tracing. You also have to respond to requests for information from other supply chain participants. So if somebody purchased something from you and they reach back to you and say, I'm doing an investigation on these 3 packages that you sold me, you have to actually respond to their request for information about where you got it from and the serial numbers. And it's written into law that you have a set amount of time in which you have to respond. And the last is that if you suspect product is illegitimate, and there's standards for that, you have to quarantine it and investigate it and either verify it as being valid, in which case you can take it out of quarantine and dispense it, or you will have to have it destroyed, or as they call it, dispositioning it from the supply chain, which means it can never be dispensed. And this obligation you have now. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Let's start with the easy one. You already know this, but you should only be buying medicine from licensed pharmaceutical distributors. That's pretty straightforward. I think there's no pharmacy who doesn't know that this is an issue. There is a guidance document that's in draft from the FDA, but I would not be surprised if there is a pharmacy in which any of this is news. And this is true for all of these different kinds of individuals, repackagers, wholesalers, etc. And the second obligation there about only trading serialized product is effective now. And here's a photo that Print Week published of a serialized product. I certainly hope that's fake, and I think it's dummy because I can see the word dummy in the lot number there. Note, however, that not everything that you handle will have serial numbers. And here's an example. This is a Shingrix vaccine vial. Um, I happen to be holding it because I got the vaccine, and it's got a barcode on it. But that barcode is not actually a DSCSA barcode. That actually is a scannable barcode that leads to more information about the vaccine. The smallest saleable package, I believe, of the Shingrix vaccine is a multiple number of vials that come in a kit. That kit is the smallest saleable package. They don't sell just the one vial. And that kit has its own single DSCSA code on that whole package. It's not repeated on every vial. So that's something to understand, is that it's the smallest saleable package. Not every element has the code on it. Now here is a medical product that I have made up for the purpose of showing you what a lot number, a DSCSA compliant label would look like. So I made this up. I made up all the ingredients. As you can see, it's manufactured for PSM Sciences, which we don't actually make any medicine. And let's take a deeper, close look at what that DSCSA label looks like. It's got 4 elements on it: a GTIN, which is a product identifier. If you're a relabeler or a repackager, you'll have a range of GTIN numbers of your own that you'll be able to use. It's got a lot and expiration, which I don't have to explain to any pharmacist today. And it's got a serial number, and that is unique to that package. And then it's got this 2D barcode, which contains all of that information repeated as well, so it can be scanned. And what's really important about this is that you're not required to pass the serial number on to the patient. So you're not required to reprint that on a label. Your software may do that, and that's perfectly fine, but that's not part of the obligation of a pharmacy. Storing it is an obligation, but actually passing it on to the patient is not. Now, there's a couple of categories of products that are written in the law that are not required to be serialized, as they call it. And you can see them here. If you routinely deal with them, then you may actually find yourself looking and wondering where the serial number is, but they're not going to be on it. Additionally, if you handle larger cases or bundles of products, sometimes those will have their own serial number that will then can be broken down or represents a larger collection. This is not really an issue that I have to spend too much time with pharmacies. If I was educating wholesalers and distributors, that would be longer, but this is about all I'm going to say about this. Okay, so let's talk about the pharmacist specific requirements. Participating in product tracing in all transaction kicks in November of 2023. And honestly, there's not a lot that you as a pharmacy today can do about it, especially if you're a community pharmacy. This is a lot of what your IT system that manages your inventory and your dispensing is going to do. And those vendors are not yet really ready to give you a product that you can test. That is going to be something that's going to come next year when they start working with and developing this feature with the wholesaler distributor community. So there's not a lot you can do, which is great because there's not an obligation you have yet. But this is something that is coming next year. I want to point out, by the way, that when you're transacting with another dispenser for a specific named patient need, then you have an exception. But it has to really be named patient need. You can't just be backfilling inventory. So if you're in the business of selling to other dispensers, you're going to have to learn a little bit more about this section. Second thing is that you have to respond to requests for information, and that's an event that's effective now. It's a compliance burden that's effective right now, and this is actually quoted from the law, this block of text on the right, which is that you have 2 business days after receiving a request from a federal or state official who's investigating suspect or illegitimate product to give them the applicable transaction information, transaction statement, and the history that you were given. And so this is an example of how you might get a call from FDA's Office of Criminal Investigation, asking you about medicines you've received from an entity. Often it comes with specific serial number requests, but it doesn't always have to. The final one, which is effective now, and I think this is one that you see pharmacies getting tripped up on because they don't realize it's effective now, is that you have to apply suspicion to products that trip your suspect filter, and we'll talk about how you get that. And then you have to investigate them in the supply chain. You have to verify where they came from. And while you're doing that, you can't be dispensing them. So you have to have quarantined them, have a procedure for that. And then at the end of the investigation, after you've done the investigation and notified everybody involved in the supply chain for that product, you'll need to either put it back in inventory because it was cleared and you found that there's nothing wrong with it, or you'll have to disposition it. So let's talk a little bit about that. Um, Suspect product is just illegitimate product that you suspect might be illegitimate. And so, for example, if you suspect that it's counterfeit, completely fake, then it's suspect product. If you suspect that it is diverted, right, it's been dispensed to a patient and then um, sold to you, or it's left the supply chain in some not legal way, or if it's stolen or adulterated, right? If you look at it, like I think that this has been opened before. I think that this seal is not actually real. Maybe it doesn't have the special printing that the company usually uses. Then that is adulterated product. That's suspect. If you have any concerns that it would cause serious adverse health consequences or death, obviously it's suspect product. If it is the subject of a fraudulent transaction, and this is a really important one because this can be the actual real product, but it was sold in a way that is fraudulent, then it is suspect product for sure and probably legitimate. Um, Anything that you have that falls into this category, you will need to set aside and do an investigation on. Now, what is your standard? What should your standards be in your pharmacy for whether or not something is a suspect product? Well, the FDA and under HHS has actually put together a guidance document about how to identify suspect product. And you can find it, and it's a lot of things that are just common sense. Pharmacists, in my opinion, are the most careful members of the supply chain when it comes to medicine. They're very suspicious. They're very, very patient safety oriented. The number of physicians I know that would routinely advise their patients to procure medicines from unsafe sources is legion, but pharmacists don't do that. They're very, very careful. They take this all very seriously. And so there's a lot of suspicions I think you probably already have that count here. It's things like, is it cheaper than the normal price? Is it coming from a wholesaler you've never heard of? I've received calls from pharmacists who are like, have you ever heard of these people? And I'm like, no. And they're like, I feel like that's a little suspicious. I'm like, well, don't buy from them. Um, if this product, according to the seller, has been down to Puerto Rico because it was ordered in excess and then sold back up north into the mainland, that's a suspicious product because it's got a weird supply chain. If it's in poor condition and you have some suspicion that the it's been damaged, or maybe um, it's not brand new from the factory and intact, then that's suspicious product. If you feel like maybe you're not convinced that this product that's supposed to be kept below 10 degrees Celsius has been allowed to get too warm, then that's suspicious product. Um, so there's more in the document, but I think that most pharmacists have a lot of common sense here. So what do? You've got suspect product. You've got an obligation to investigate suspect product. So what do? Well, first is you identify everything suspect in your possession and you quarantine it. If you suspect one or more packages from a seller and that causes you to wonder about the seller's integrity, then maybe everything from that seller is suspect and you need to quarantine it all. The next thing you need to do is you need to notify all the trading partners. So if you sold it to somebody else, then you need to notify them and you need to notify the people you bought it from. And frankly, the first call you should make should be to the manufacturer. You need to verify, and this is the investigation part, The serial numbers, the lot numbers, and the product identifiers, everything about the transaction for at least 3 packages or 10% of suspect product. If you bought 100 packages, 100 bottles of something, you got to verify 10 of them. If you bought 4, you've got to verify 3 of them, right? It's 3 or 10%, whichever is more. You also have to verify the entire transaction history and information. And that means that you need to ask the person who sold it to you all the people who have owned it since it came from the original manufacturer and verify with them that they owned it. Otherwise, you don't know if the transaction history you've got is a complete falsehood. If it has been owned by 8 different distributors on the way to you, then you're making at least 8 phone calls. And once you're done with this thing, you've got to keep the records of this investigation for 6 years. And at the end of this investigation, if everything checks out, you've got cleared product, you can notify everybody in the supply chain that it was fine, that you cleared it, and you can move it out of quarantine and dispense it. If you've got illegitimate product, you again have to notify everybody in the supply chain for this, all your trading partners, and then you have to make sure it never ever gets dispensed. And you can't return it to the person who sold it to you. You have to hold on to it and ultimately probably destroy it, keeping at least a sample for testing for the FDA. Now, if it is illegitimate, the FDA is going to want to know, and they've got a form for it. So yay. It's form 3911. This is what it looks like. It's a 2-page form, and you can fill it out, and there's instructions for submitting it online. But that's all pretty straightforward. So let's talk about verifying serial numbers. Every major pharmaceutical manufacturer has a brand protection team. Some of them are pretty awesome. The Gilead brand protection team actually will not only take your call and tell you if a serial number for a bottle that you've bought of Gilead product is valid, they will actually do the investigation for you. They'll call every single entity in the supply chain and tell you whether or not that thing is real. That'll save you a lot of time. Most of the other brand protection teams, I've never heard of that offer, but it's because Gilead has been in overdrive trying to ensure that some criminals that have been falsifying their product get caught as fast as possible. Usually if you find some insert on the product about product integrity and where to call, that's going to be the way you reach the brand protection team for a manufacturer. And manufacturers have obligations to answer you very, very quickly. So it's going to be a pretty fast answer you're going to get from them. You know, there are new systems coming that will allow you to do this kind of tracing without phone calls, but until they're developed, you're making a lot of phone calls. And you know, you have to verify where they bought it from, where they sold it to, the date, the serial number. You have to make sure that all that stuff that is on the piece of paper that you have, that is the transaction history and the transaction information, is actually matched up with what the entities say. Now, some people have asked me, well, can I just have my prime wholesaler do all this? Why do I have to actually make all these phone calls if I have what I think is suspect product? Well, the first reason is that you probably didn't get suspect product from your prime. If you have suspect product, my guess is that maybe it came from a wholesaler or distributor that you got a good deal from. And so that's the first thing I would tell you is they're not going to help you investigate a too good to be true deal that you got from somebody else. But the Healthcare Distribution Alliance, which is the trade association for the wholesaler distributor industry, actually put out a handout about what they will and won't help with, and you can read that and check it out. But the answer is they're gonna you still have to fulfill your own obligations to investigate suspect product. They're simply not going to make all those phone calls for you. You can expect them to store transaction information, history, and statements for the products they sold you. They're happy to test your software when it's updated next year to understand serial numbers and make sure that that's working. And they will happily work with you on doing an investigation in the sense that they will answer the questions that they're legally obligated to do, but they're not going to actually conduct the explanation for you. let's go ahead and go to the next and do some examples. So let's take this as a sales history. I've made this one up. Um, when I do trainings around some of the most recent Descovy and Biktarvy supply chain breaks, this is one I use. Um, right now, because of sort of a quirk in the implementation of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, if you're buying product, you're often getting a whole transaction history from factory floor to the person who sells it to you. And I've just made one up and it looks like this. It went from Gilead to ABC to someone called American Wholesale Drug Mart and then to Joe's Meds, who's in Weehawken, who's offering it to you. Now, you're going to have to call every entity. So you're making at least 4 phone calls here or emails, and you're going to need to get them to verify, did you sell these packages with these serial numbers to this entity on this date? And if there's pricing in there, you're going to have to validate that. There's one funny trick that counterfeiters who've been working recently have been using, which is they've been faking these transaction histories, and they've been faking them and saying, okay, Gilead Sciences sold this product to cheapo wholesale meds. But it turns out that Gilead Sciences only sells their products to somewhere between 16 and 20 licensed distributors. That's it. And if you go to Gilead's website and you see that cheapo wholesale meds is not in that list, you know this thing is fraudulent from the get-go. You don't have to make any more phone calls. This is done. So I'd always start with that trick. Even before I'd call Gilead, I'd just double check that because that'll save you a whole lot of aggravation. If you find that, by the way, you're dealing with a distributor who is probably criminal or dumb enough to get taken in by criminals, shouldn't do any more business with them. Here's an example from the Gilead website that shows for these products the list of a partial list. They're not all on the screen of the distributors that they only deal with. And again, if it is not to one of these, it is a fraudulent transaction and you should not be dispensing that medicine. You should be holding it and notifying the FDA. Of course, you have the same rights to make these requests as a federal or state official, and it's written in statute that manufacturers, wholesalers, and repackagers have to give you an answer in a set amount of time, just like they can make a request to you. So, it's still very, very tight turnaround for these folks, and you absolutely can go ahead and do that. Now, obviously, there's a question here about how does this affect returns? And, for saleable product, you don't have to provide any of these things, transaction history, information, or statement, if you're returning to the same trading partner that you bought the products from. For non-saleable product, you can return it to certain categories of folks without having to provide transaction information, like manufacturers, repackagers, the wholesaler where you got it, a returns processor, or anybody acting legally on behalf of one of those entities. Now, there are criminal penalties for violating the DSCSA. As far as I know, and in every DOJ lawyer I've talked to, no one has ever been charged with these. But they are, small, although a year in jail is not small, I guess, if you have to do it. But a year and or $1,000 fine for a first offense. Subsequent offenses or offenses with intent to defraud or mislead, like if you falsify a transaction history, 3 years up to $10,000. This is not the only problem you will have. If you are caught violating the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, if you're caught forging these transactions, you are going to be facing both civil charges and sanctions from your regulatory board, the Board of Pharmacy. It's not going to be just about this particular charge. In fact, you may wish that was the only charge you dealt with. Additionally, and this is new, we're seeing manufacturers use the Lanham Act, which is a trademark act, to go after criminals who trade counterfeit products or diverted products in the supply chain as trademark violators. And this is particularly dangerous for pharmacies because these penalties, even though they don't contain jail time, are so financially expensive that it's a bankruptcy event for a small pharmacy. It is an enormous amount of money. There's all sorts of damages they can levy on you, including trademark attorney's fees. So, the company hires a very expensive trademark attorney to bring a Lanham Act civil case against you in court, and then you have to pay the fees of the guy who's suing you, which is pretty awful. So it is not just about patient safety, but simply like legal and financial survival that you don't skirt any of these obligations. The medicine could be absolutely real, but if it's been altered in some way, it's a violation of the Lanham Act, and it's a strict liability statute. So if you get duped by a sketchy wholesaler and you don't ask enough questions, and then you get hit with a Lanham Act charge, a Lanham Act case, you don't get to say, well, I didn't know, because you should have known, and they will start to cost you very, very serious quantities of money. So as you're getting your pharmacy ready, and I would start this now, right? I think you have some obligations now that are probably new to you, because not a lot of people know about the DSCSA. You need to think about what kind of procedures you have in your organization for how you investigate and suspect product. How you check licensure of people selling product to you, if it's not coming from your prime, right? Prime licenses are pretty easy to check, and you probably know your prime's name. And if you've never looked their license up with your state board of pharmacy, it's never too late to do that. But how you suspect product, what you use as a basis for suspicion, how you do investigations, the fact that you're obligated to do those should all be a, a, a policy and a procedure for your pharmacy today. There are companies that are starting to produce products, IT products, for helping you to implement these policies and procedures, and they're going to be very different depending on what kind of pharmacy environment you operate in, be it a chain pharmacy versus a small community pharmacy or a hospital pharmacy or a nursing home or whatever. But you're going to clearly need to be able to have a procedure so that every employee can say that they were told that they must verify and document licensure of trading partners, how you process inbound and outbound product. The fact that you must visually inspect it and look for signs of suspicion is going to need to be a policy that you have. How you categorize product as suspect, how you quarantine it, and how you handle requests for verification. These are all things that need to be standard procedures in your organization. Obviously, your prime wholesaler is not going to help you do any of this for product that you didn't buy from them. And so you're going to need to actually handle some of these in-house. If you buy a lot of product from your non-prime wholesalers, that is going to increase your workload. And so that's a really important thing to remember. All right, so there's a couple things. If you are interested, there's a big coalition of groups that we all know and love who've put together a DSCSA educational portal at dscsa.pharmacy. And, every single one of those folks is an ally to you and me, and so it's worth taking a look at. There's also a great book by Dirk Rogers. If you're really into wanting to read the original law and understand it, it goes through the law in detail. It's available on Amazon as both an ebook and a printed book. And then, of course, Dangerous Doses, which is one of the most famous stories, true stories, of an up-labeling counterfeit scam in America that happened in the early 2000s, is something that you should check out. All right, let me pop back on screen here. Thank you for your time today. You can find us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on Instagram, and Facebook. We do one of these videos about a new counterfeit incident every week. Our website is constantly being updated, and there's a lot of information there. We've basically been publishing since the early 2000s. And finally, I want to make a pitch to you. As a pharmacist, if you receive sketchy offers from wholesalers that you think are suspicious, please forward them to us. We are collecting them. We're trying to learn as much as possible about how people try and defraud pharmacists so we can increase our pharmacist education because we believe that pharmacists need to be protected from criminals, and we value pharmacists and want them to stay in business and continue to be the thin white line of safety that stands between criminals and the rest of our safe drug supply. Um, Go ahead and forward them to editors at safemedicines.org. I'll tell you that already this year someone's forwarded us a scam involving fraudulent sales of COVID vaccines that was super fun to get and then to share with individuals at one of the vaccine makers. So that was a way in which some pharmacist did some really good work to help protect lots of other pharmacists. That's all for today. If you really like this talk, you can have us give it at your state pharmacy conference or some other pharmacy conference. For members of the Partnership for Safe Medicines, we will cover most of the costs of sending a speaker to you. So it's definitely worth it to be a member. Reach out to us if that's something of interest. And keep an eye on this webpage on our website for more information about DSCSA and what it means for pharmacists. Thanks and have a great day.